Nietzsche tried to look at all matters such as morality or religion, sciences or art, from the octaves of life. So did Spinoza too. Deleuze Guattari also want to deal with all the matters as those of life, which is to make different lives through creation and experimentation. It is no different even when dealing with extremely abstract philosophical concepts such as difference, becoming, being, and immanence. The same is true of the concept of politics. Repeating to draw the lines of mutation and becoming into the life that gets solidified as much as it gets stabilized, and confronting all the components that confine things in the solidified frame for this, that exactly is politics. When that confrontation stands against states, apparatuses, or institutions, macropolitics works. And micropolitics comes into play when it passes through an organism called I, or between signs that signify subjectify. Drawing a creative line of flight along the line of molecular segmentarity that escapes the unavoidable line of motor segmentarity, this gives directions to their political thinking. In other words, politics can be said to be the actuation of a kind of abstract machine that operates across the body and thought. Therefore, it can be said that the ethics for producing a good life and the politics of becoming are on one plane. The concept of the minor or minority is located at the intersection of the concrete issues commonly considered realistic affairs and this kind of political thinking. The so-called minority politics or politics of minority emerges there. The concept of minority first appeared in Kafka, published under the subtitle Toward the Minor Literature. The study of Kafka's literature and language gave birth to the concept of minority. In A Thousand Plateaus, published later, it is in the sections of postulates of linguistics and becoming, and at the last part of Apparatus of Capture, dealing with the matters of capital and states, that the concept of minority is heavily used. To put it simply, while language and becoming minor are close to the realm of micropolitics, Apparatus of Capture that deals with the minority movement inside the axiomatic system of capital and state apparatuses is close to that of macropolitics. Minority politics is based on the survival conditions of the minor that connect its individual intrigue immediately to politics. These conditions make everything take on the collective value. It is for this reason that Deleuze Guattari say that literature is the people's concern, quoting from Kafka's diary. This also is a characteristic of minor literature. This is also not irrelevant to the fact that the concept of the minor is at the intersection of micropolitics and macropolitics. To fully understand what the concept of minority means, we will first need to go through Kafka and minor literature. This is because we often misunderstand minority as a lack of the major or the denial of majority. It should be emphasized that minority is not this kind of negative concept, but rather a positive concept of becoming. As you know, Kafka was a Jew in Prague. Although he was a writer whose writing was his life itself, he wrote in German, not Czech, Hebrew, or Yiddish. But he didn't write in rich and beautiful German like Goethe. On the contrary, he wrote in poor and concise German, which couldn't be said to be wrong, but was somewhat strange German. It was strange German of the minor, that is a Jew, what's more, in the distant part that is Prague. If he had written in beautiful German following the Goethe canon, the result would have been faithful obedience to German at best. It is most likely that he would have lamented his poor German. On the other hand, if he had written in Czech, Hebrew, or Yiddish, he would have become a writer of ethnic literature, but would have no influence on the German language that besieged him and enforced obedience. The predicament where he could neither use German faithfully nor not use it, that was the condition which made Kafka find a new way out. The poverty of that language is not the lack of expression ability, but the void of ellipses and the mutation for the territorialization. Under this condition, literature becomes a kind of confrontation and struggle. It is Kim Si-jung who, as a Korean resident in Japan and as a minor of the colonial empire like Kafka, did literature in Japanese that well shows the mentality of this kind of struggling confrontation. Rejecting national literature, supposed to be written in Korean, his mother language, he writes in Japanese, the language of the colonizer. The reason he did so is to revenge for the Japanese language. Since it is Japanese that shapes his emotions and surrounds his life like the atmosphere, writing his works in his native mother language leads to a path of avoidance and isolation in ways of rejection. On the contrary, confronting his familiar Japanese language, he chooses to push what is not in the Japanese language into it. To create a Japanese language that is irremovable because it is sandpapery and unfamiliar, but attractive, and give it back to it, he says that it is exactly his revenge for the Japanese language. It is an amazing idea that makes even revenge positive and creative. Kafka also says that his writing is such a confrontation. The literary struggle going on by creating a new language within the dominant major language at the predicament that prevents this Jew of Prague from writing, that is Kafka's literature. Using strange German language that is neither follow nor denial, he wrote attractive works that one can never throw away. The strange German language that makes the German language stammer by penetrating deep into it through the territory occupied by the force of that attraction, that is Kafka's German language. The literature that confronts the major through a strange language that territorializes from the major language within it as such, that is minor literature. Minor language should also be understood in this way. The reason a minor language is called so is not that it has a small number of users. Every modern country has a standard language and determines the others as dialects. In Korea, for example, its standard language is the modern Seoul language widely used by educated people. The standard language is the one that is chosen among various languages and becomes the measure. It was the major language but was not the one used by many. There are not that many educated people in Seoul. However, once you create a standard language, it can be used by many because it is used in official documents or by media and taught in schools. The reason it becomes the measure is not that the users are many. Its being the measure results in the number of users being many. Therefore, the word major is similar to the word mainstream. Those belonging to the mainstream are dominant, but not many. For example, the major in capitalist society are capitalists, and in the patriarchal society, the major are men. But that's not because the number is large. It is the mainstream and the major that sees the measure. The matter of the minor major is not that of number. A minor language is not a dialect, but a new language created within a language and a foreign language within the mother language. It is not a language that needs to be protected from the major language, but a language that confronts it and makes it stammer, and a language that invents something new. It is a language that confronts measure and standard. Therefore, it is not defined by the distance from the measure, but by the ability to change the measure. It is also the ability to mutate the major language that makes a dialect become a minor language. Literally, language like Kafka's is not the only minor language. This is also the case with Black English, which changes English into something very different by involving Canton slangs and by using abbreviations and omissions, ambiguity and substitution, etc. Like minor language, minors don't mean a small group. It is not the one far away from the dominant measure or value, nor so-called the marginal or the alienated. For example, the poor are far from the measure of capitalism in that they have no money. But if they are only obsessed with making money, they are not minors. They are marginals in that they are not free from the measure of money, but are lacking what they have as their measure. The same goes for a black person who hates his skin and rubs it with a scrubber, or a woman who believes that liberation means having the same power as men. They are negative sign majors in that they follow the majority that he lacks. Minors are not those who merely reject the dominant major and persist to separate from it. Minors are not those that insist on and protect separate collectivity, but those who create something that changes the major and push it into the major world. They are those that seek out various allies for it. Allies here don't just mean humans. Allies include animals, plants, things, languages, molecules, and waves, etc. Therefore, minor is not a word that indicates the current state. It is defined by becoming that changes the current state. A minor is always constructed through becoming minor. For example, as shown in Toni Morrison's Paradise, when a certain characteristic of black people being adhered to as the dominant major, there emerges symmetrical oppression that discriminates mixed blood based on the measure of negritude. When a certain characteristic of woman is used as natural measure to confront man, women who lack such a characteristic, transgenders, and homosexuals are subject to discrimination and exclusion. What is important is to create a new way and measure of life crossing between white and black, masculinity and femininity. It is for this reason that even blacks must become black, even women must become women. I repeat, majority and minority are not defined by numbers. The relationship between major, minor, and number is indeed complex and paradoxical. First, if we define the majority by certain characteristics or states, they are very few in number. In the United States, for example, whites are the majority, but not many of them are not mixed blood with other races. Pure whites with fair skin but without a history of mixed blood would be really rare. On the contrary, there are countless minors, for all of those who have a past of mixed blood should be called minors even if their skin is white. Therefore, using the concept of infinite set theory, the Luscotari say that the minority is a non-denumerable set, while the majority is a denumerable set even if many. A denumerable set means numbers that can be corresponded to with natural numbers one after another. A non-denumerable set means numbers that can be corresponded to with natural numbers one by one, that is, countless numbers. Since the minority is composed by connections or mixes, it asserts the power of non-denumerable even if the minority is composed of a single member. Connections and mixes mean the virtuality of becoming that can bounce anywhere. The non-denumerable is important for this reason, not because they are large in number. On the other hand, the majority can be a numerical majority. That is because they dominate the measure and standard. A measure or standard is considered the value that everyone should follow, so those not belonging to the majority are likely to follow it. When the measure and standard are shared as such, those not belonging to the majority also tend to think and act in the same way as the majority. The same goes for workers who are interested only in making money, women who are more masculine than men. Those that follow the dominant measure are exactly the majority. For different reasons than this, the minority in the Luscotari sense are far fewer than we think. That is because the minority are not those belonging to a category sharing certain characteristics like black people, women, colonized people, natives, etc., but those who create new expression machines, new way of life, and new measures. Becoming minor defines the minority. However, just as a dialect has a great ability to become a minor language, even though not a minor language, a minority as a state has a great virtuality to move forward to becoming minor. For the lives of the minority are inevitably political even when they are individual because they have to live lives besieged by the major power every moment, and it triggers the desire to change the current conditions of life. The minor condition implies the virtuality for becoming minor for the passive life of minority movement. Becoming minor is to push such virtuality to a different sensibility or a different consciousness to form a new alliance, a new community. The minority is heterogeneous and mixed, and is multiplied by connections and mutations. The minority is created by the alliances or communities constituted by the mixing of the heterogeneous. Such countless connections and mixes have a generative capacity that is not limited to the axiomatic system of capital. The revolutionary force of the minority comes from this. The Luscotari say the creation of undesirable proposition or demand out of the axiomatic system exactly the germ and locus par excellence of revolutionary decisions. Of course, the axiomatic system of capital can capture propositions and demands that's created by adding them again as axioms. However, Gödel's theorem implies that undesirable propositions can be newly created even if captured in such a way. There's no absolute saturation where no more axioms can be added. The saturation is itself relative. At the same time, no axiomatic capture can prevent the creation of new undesirable proposition. There is no end to capturing and creating of the undesirable. There is only the immanent process where the creation, capture, and recreation of the undesirable are repeated. This process, which Marx would have been called permanent revolution, would have been called eternal return if it had been Nietzsche. This concept of minority is important for politics to find its way in the relationship between desire and power. The book Kafka, where the concept of minority appears, is also the one where a proposition specifying the immanent relationship between desire and power rather than the opposition between the two appears. That is this proposition. It is power itself that is desire. Thereby, desire and power are not two separate and opposing concepts, but are mutually immanent ones that create one another. You can't say that the one is good and the other is bad. Then, a question arises as to how it is possible to criticize and resist power. This is because the evaluation of desire and power and the resultant selection lose their direction. This is similar to the theoretical predicament into which Foucault fell by emphasizing the positivity of power, saying power produces. As you know, Foucault studied power to find points of resistance. Where there is power, there is resistance. But he also arrives at the immanence of desire and power. Where there is desire, the power relation is already present. An illusion, then, to denounce this relation for a repression exerted after the event, but vanity as well, to go questing after a desire that is beyond the reach of power. Power is productive and comes from below. Therefore, there is no reason to resist power. In A Thousand Pleiades, Deleuze Guattari establishes a base for evaluation within its immanence through the proposition the power is the stratified desire and the line of flight is primary. However, the primariness of conceptual status alone is not enough to find the course between the desire and power that become each other. It is for this reason that it is important to discern the majority and minority among conflicting desires and conflicting powers. What is important is not to choose between the rigid motor and flexible molecular segmentarity of desire power, but to draw a minor positive flight line between the two. That is becoming minor and the politics of the minority.